Divine, the most merciful, the most kind. You see, I sit and I try and write some poetry, but I do not want it to be flowing from the anger inside of me. I want every word to be embedded with love, carried on the backs of doves to the ears and to the hearts of those who are listening to me. I want to be taken to a place where I can hear the birds sing and the trees, yes, the trees are rustling in the winds. A place where I can hold the hand of my Jewish, my Buddhist, my Christian, my human brethren. A place where the color of my skin or the direction in which I pray in is not a concern to those who are around me. A place where it does not matter about the why, what, or how you're going to avenge your enemies by killing innocent children in the streets. No, I'm not concerned because of their nationality. I'm concerned because this is humanity. You see, I sit and I try and write some poetry, but I do not want it to be flowing from the anger inside of me, only fueling the frustration and hate in those who are listening to me. You see, we're on a time frame, and there's not enough time or space for my rhymes to be promoting hate. I want to hold my head up high and say to the divine that I chose to love. Yes, I chose to love his creation, despite anger, hate, war, poverty. I chose to love. So call me crazy, or a hippie, or even a Sufi if you wish. Your labels mean nothing to me, because I am here to love. And I'm gonna keep on loving till you're begging, please, please, let me join the oceans of mercy.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to this very special event. Let me start my video there so that you can see me. Yes, you might be able to see me. I'm Anne Easter. I'm a councillor. I'm also a priest in the Church of England, and I'm the Commissioner for Interfaith and Interreligious Dialogue. And it's my great privilege this evening to be hosting this event. Let me just give you some housekeeping, and that is that attendees are automatically muted, as you can read there, videos turned off when you're joining the Zoom. This webinar is being recorded so that we can use it elsewhere, so please remember that. Use the question and answer window. Now, I know that very often on a Zoom, you have a thing called a chat at the bottom. Now, we're not going to do that. We're going to have question and answer. If you go down to the bottom of your screen where you'd normally see chat, it says question and answer. So if you have a question, please type it in there and it will be read out and answered live by the panelists who are going to be with us this evening. And then finally, this is live. Please be forgiving. And of course, that's the motto for life, whatever we do, isn't it? We always have to be kind and forgiving. I was born in Newham and I'm brought up and deliberately stay here because I love it. And one of the important things for me about Newham is that it's very normal to have a faith. It's not unusual or different. Most people have a faith in Newham, and That's great, because I think it adds a very special dimension to our lives. And the panelists that we've invited here this evening are going to talk about how faith influences their work. We've got Shahed Saleem, an architect who specialises in places of worship. We've got Vaseem Khan, who's an author who's written a lot of fiction. We've got Rabiah from the Pearls of Islam, and you may have heard one of their poems as you were coming onto the Zoom, and Mohammed Ali, who's an Arabic and Soul City arts founder, and Aerosol. I'm not quite sure what that means, but I'm sure Mohammed will tell us and let us know. So let's get on. Our first speaker is Shahed Saleem, the architect from the University of Westminster. Shahed is particularly interested in the architecture of places of worship, and he's designed some very interesting designs, and he's also researched the history. He was commissioned by English Heritage, indeed, to research and write the architectural and social history of the British Mosque. Because, of course, the important thing about places of worship is that they're places of people too. So, Shahed, I'm going to hand over to you now. We're running a very few moments late. I will come to you when you've got 3 minutes left. I'll let you know. All right? Over to Shahed now. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you very much, Anne, and good evening to everybody here. I will share my screen. Right. Now, what I'm going to do is just very quickly talk about a very quick background to my own work as an architect. And in my work, I work on some mosque projects. So I'm exploring the architecture and identity for new mosque architecture in this country. And I sort of contextualize that with the research work that I've done looking at the history of the mosque in Britain, which was the research that I did for this book, which was published a couple of years ago. And I'm going to run through a couple of slides very quickly just to get us up to speed. This is the first mosque that was built, the first built mosque in Britain. It was in 1889, built in Woking, and it's still there, and it's still functioning as a mosque. And this is really a kind of representation of that sort of Victorian Orientalist style of architecture, and it was very much in keeping with the image of kind of Muslim countries and Muslim lands of the day. Now, around the same time, there was a house mosque that was built in Liverpool. Now, the Liverpool Muslim Institute was actually started in 1887 by a Muslim convert called Abdullah William Quilliam, and he bought this house in 1889, he converted it and started the first, congregational community mosque. And on the right-hand side, you can see an image there of the interior of the house as he started to design it. So what you start to see is the kind of introduction of this Islamic styles and architecture into the English, kind of domestic landscape. And that's something that is characterizes mosque architecture in this country. Now, there was, before the Second World War, there was really only a handful of Muslim communities in this country. The populations were quite small, and it was often people who were moving through the country, coming from mostly South Asia, coming to England, staying for some time, maybe studying or working, and then returning. There wasn't so many settled communities, and this was all part of the process of the kind of colonial period, when there was this kind of interchange between the colonies and Britain. Now, Second World War, partition of India and the creation of Pakistan, and later Bangladesh, created this kind of movement, this immigration movement from the former Commonwealth, not just South Asia, but also from former Commonwealth countries, from the Caribbean and South Asia in particular. And that really sort of transformed the social and the religious landscape of Britain, and particularly in towns and cities where many people settled. And what that resulted in was what we'd call a diaspora community. So communities that have been dislocated from their places of origin, and they have to kind of create a new life in a new place. And what I'm interested in is that process that goes from the colonial period through that process of immigration to this condition of the diaspora, which is what we have now and what we exist in now. And I'm interested in that period of diaspora that we're in now. How do we create and recreate and reconstruct cultures, which is what I think diasporas are doing. And I think a lot of that is through memories and myths as well, of places that have been left behind, but also places that we imagine are there. And we try to recreate and reconstruct them in our new places of abode, of living. Now, the mosques that were built in that early period of post-war migration were built from the sort of 1960s. 1970s, you started to get purpose-built mosques emerging. And they were very much a sort of combination of Islamic styles, often taken from textbooks or from what people remembered or experiences that people had of Muslim countries or the countries that they'd come from. And these kind of Islamic elements were applied onto existing, the kind of vernacular English architecture. So you started to get these combinations of buildings where, local brickwork or pitched roofs or gables, things that are very traditional and characteristic of English architecture were being combined with these new Islamic elements as people brought them over and remembered them. And a lot of these mosques were very much self-built buildings. They were built by the communities that were establishing them and designed by the communities that were establishing them. And that gives them a very interesting design architecture. Now, in the 80s or in sort of late, things started to shift, I think, for Muslims in Britain. And 1989, which was the point of the Rushdie protests, is usually taken as the time when a Muslim identity started to emerge, which started to become separate from a racial identity. So the idea of kind of religion as a categorization or as an identifier started to emerge around this period. And I think the Rushdie protest and the Rushdie affair would have contributed to that. But I think there were wider things also going on geopolitically, which contributed to the emergence of a specifically Muslim identity. And one of the things was that new generations or second generations of migrants were looking for a way to connect to a culture that was not necessarily rooted in their sort of South Asian backgrounds, but something that they could connect to directly. That alongside the kind of increasing prominence of Muslims in media, the way in which sort of Muslim culture and identity and so on were being scrutinized, which we're all familiar with, so I don't need to really go over that more. But these are all combining to create a certain kind of positionality of Muslims in sort of late 20th century Britain. Now, what happened architecturally, I think, or what I've noted, is that there was an increase in kind of more historicist and if you like, authentic Islamic buildings. So mosques, I think, started to try and be more historically sort of revivalist, if you like. And this is just a few examples that I'm flicking through, and you can sort of see where there are mosques in Leeds and Bradford and so on. And I think communities were starting to try and be much more assertive about a more explicit Muslim identity through their buildings, which may correlate with these shifts that were taking place in wider culture. So there's this move towards the traditional, towards the historicist, towards a kind of more revivalist architecture going on. And that leads to this debate around identity. And a couple of years ago, Baroness Vaseem made a statement that mosques should be more English, as it were, designed without minarets and so on, to fit in more with the landscape. So it raises issues about what kind of architecture is sort of English and what kind of architecture is sort of alien, if you like. And the idea of tradition and modernity is then also a question that comes up. And is our modern mosques, whatever that might mean, more appropriate a response to building mosques in this country and in the West, and should the kind of traditional symbolism be rejected, if you like? Now, what I'm interested in is what's actually happened. I'm interested in what people have actually built in this country. And in terms of moving on to my own work, I sort of have carried out a series of drawings. When I was doing my research, I would travel around, look at different places, look at different mosques, and I'd make a series of drawings of my impressions of the way in which people had actually built mosques that I was looking at. And again, this was through incremental processes of combination, amalgamating different types of building and creating these sort of improvised ad hoc types of religious spaces. And 80% of mosques in Britain are created from existing buildings and embedded within the existing urban landscape. And I found that really quite fascinating, how this new architecture was emerging through the combination of the kind of given English or townscape and the mosque language. And I did a series of drawings, and I started to see what would happen if I started to formalize this language into a kind of propositional architecture. So these are kind of exploratory drawings looking at the types of building that might emerge when we start to look at this process, or as I started to work through this process of observing and then turning it into architectural proposals. And this is, again, for example, a kind of sculptural object, which is a representation of these different influences that go into the creation of a new visual language for Muslim architecture in Britain. Now, the other thing that I was interested in, or have been interested in, is the way in which there's a kind of revival of traditional Islamic arts and very popular revival of, for example, the creation of geometric art. You get various courses that you can do and books and so on. And the emphasis is to try and recreate in a very authentic and exact way this kind of geometric pattern work. And it's as if you're trying to reconstruct a sort of cultural heritage. And what I was interested in is what happens if you go through those processes, but you go through them without being precise and without the tools and without the compasses and so on, and you allow the mistakes to stay within the drawing, or to stay within the pattern, and you create a new pattern out of it. So what I'm interested in is how you can start to create your own language through a kind of imperfect translation of the traditional heritages and traditional cultures, because again, I think that that's more a sort of appropriate, if you like, or more reflective of the diasporic condition that we're in, that we're reconstructing things in this kind of piecemeal way and fragmented way. And then the question then is, how does one take that into a new architecture, into new Islamic architecture? So for a particular project that I worked on in East London, I took this particular tile from the 13th century Turkish tile, and I used this as a basis for a design. And I looked at a part of this tile. I sort of picked a fragment of it. Again, the idea of the kind of fragment and the part. And I looked at changing the scale of that and then using that for the facade of the building. So that became the facade of this new mosque in East London. It was a combination of an existing house mosque and then the new mosque was the rear part. So you don't have the whole of the pattern, you have a part of the pattern, and then it gets combined with other things. There's another project that I worked on in Aberdeen. This is the site here. And here again, I was looking at different ways of creating sort of pattern work, working with kind of Celtic style patterns as well, to sort of combine local geometric ideas with Islamic geometric ideas, because this was in Scotland, so to try to sort of embed it within that culture, and looking at different ways of creating that facade. And I worked with an artist called Lubna Chowdhury, and she created a bespoke handmade ceramic tiles, and those tiles became embedded in the facade of the building. So one part of the facade was this more sort of traditional Islamic arabesque pattern work, and that was embedded within a more sort of contemporary arrangement of elements, so the kind of different concrete cladding and granite block work. Then some other kind of exploratory work was a piece of work that I did a couple of years ago in the V&A, and here I was asked to make a sculpture which responded to this mosque, which was a model of a mosque from Ahmedabad, and it was a 19th century model of a 15th century mosque, I think it was, and I was making a response to it. So I looked around the gallery and looked at other things that were in the gallery, other objects, and I created a model which was a sort of combination of the different elements that were in the gallery. So again, I was sort of picking up on the idea of the mosque being an amalgamation of many different influences and drawing from vernacular things around it, And this model was made completely out of paper because that was actually the requirement of the exhibition.
Just 2 minutes now, Shahed. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Annie. I'm coming to the end. And this is a photograph of the model in the gallery, and how it's sat on top of the existing model, so that you could see it. You can see my kids there. They don't look very interested, but they're very helpful on the day. And this is again a project that I'm working with the V&A on, which is for a installation which will be again a representation of the history of the mosque in Britain. And the idea of this is that it will be a much more a kind of celebratory, similar to the model, the paper model, a kind of celebration of all the different kind of influences and the way in which mosques have been created through this kind of amalgamation, and the drawing of a range of different visual references and pulling them together into this new sort of language, into a new frame. And I'm interested in the new frames and the new geometries and the combinations that this new way of creating mosque architecture in this country has created. I think it's a hugely you know, creative and generative sort of field of architecture, which is what I'm trying to reference in this installation here, which we hope will be built next year, but everything is kind of up in the air at the moment. And I shall finish there. Thank you very much, Anne.
Thank you so much, Shahed. I think your work is beautiful. I love it. And I love the way that you incorporate traditional things and more modern ideas. It makes it so attractive and retains our history too. So thank you very much. If I can just tell everyone, we're going to have a time for questions at the end. Well, not at the end, sort of 2/3 of the way through. So there should be plenty of time to ask your questions. And then Shahed will answer questions as you've asked them. So type them in the question place now if you want to, and you will see them hopefully being answered, as long as they're not too complicated. You may have to have a written answer. Thank you, Shahed. Thank you very much. And now we go on to our next panelist, who's called Vaseem Khan. Now, if you've ever enjoyed one of these books, you will have enjoyed Vaseem's work. He's the author of 2 crime series set in India, the Baby Ganesh Agency series and the Malabar House historical crime novels, and I'll bet that you would love them because they're exciting and interesting and available from our libraries, of course. Vaseem has won awards for his work, the Instant Eye Arts, the Culture and Theatre Award for Literature. Vaseem was born in Newham, but he spent a decade working in India as a management consultant. So when he writes about them, he knows about both. Welcome, Vaseem. Over to you, and I'll let you know when you've got 2 minutes.
Thank you, Anne. I'm just going to start my stopwatch. And thank you to Newham Council for putting on such a topical event. Islamophobia is obviously a big problem at the moment, but in essence, it's no different to other forms of hatred that try and divide a community. No different to homophobia or racism or anti-Semitism, in that it tries to paint a particular segment of the community in a negative light. So what this event is about is really about changing some of the perceptions around what Muslims are, what they do. And for me, I'm going to talk about my career as a writer. And for many of you who know anything about the publishing industry, you'll know that it's very underrepresented in terms of people of color, not just Muslims. And so it's been a very long journey, and we'll talk about some of those barriers. But one of the barriers that Muslims have, or Asians in general, people of color in general have, is that sometimes writing is not considered a profession that's worthy of us to pursue. So that's a barrier that starts in the home. So I'm just going to share my screen and start my presentation, because the title of this sort of gives it away. Okay, so the doctor, lawyer, accountant syndrome. Many in the audience will know exactly what I'm talking about. And certainly when I wanted to be a writer, my parents were of the same disposition. They didn't really think that this was a career that I should be pursuing. In the end, I did end up studying accountancy, and I ended up being a management consultant, as you've mentioned. But let's go backwards a little. Here are my parents. They came from the subcontinent to live in the UK more than 45 years ago. Neither of them are alive at the moment. And here they are. With my brothers and sisters. No prizes for guessing which one I am. They moved to Newham, and that's where they lived their whole lives while they were in the UK. Now, I lived in Newham until the age of 23, when I was asked to go to India by this chap, my boss at the time. He was running a small consultancy in Stratford, and he got a deal to work in India. And his name was Terry Brewer. And we ended up spending 10 wonderful years in India at a time when India was making a transition from being a largely pre-industrial economy to being on the verge of a global superpower as she is today. And, you know, vast wealth was flowing into the country. It was changing the dynamic of the urban centers in particular. We've all seen some of that. I mean, you've all benefited from call center calls, I'm sure. But after I'd spent a decade in India and I came back to the UK, and I decided that I wanted to write about my experiences in India and turn it into fiction. And that led directly to me writing my first book. Now, bearing in mind, I'd wanted to be an author since the age of 17, but I hadn't actually gotten anywhere with it. I'd sent in a few novels, completed them, but they'd been rejected. And so I was as surprised as anyone else when I got a 4-book deal by one of the world's largest publishers, Shahed. And this was the first book in that series, The Unexpected Inheritance of Inspector Chopra. And what this book is, it's a crime story, and it's about a very rigid, honest policeman from the Mumbai police service who goes into early retirement. And he's confronted by the murder of a poor boy from a local slum. And he decides that he wants to go off and solve this murder, even though he's not an active police officer anymore. And the other thing that happens to him is that he inherits a 1-year-old baby elephant. So while he's solving this crime, he also has to figure out how to look after this elephant. So the book was quite successful. It set me up for a writing career. It was a Times bestseller, and it's published around the world now. And it's meant that I've been able to write an entire series off the back of that. And that's allowed me to express myself a little bit more, because often when you come in as a person from a minority background, there are expectations within the industry about the kind of things you should or shouldn't write about. So for me, this was my chance to show a little bit about India and the various communities that I saw and the way that they interact with each other. And that's what each of these books does. There's a crime for Chopra to solve, but there's also an examination of the fabric of Indian life and how it weaves together. And the last book in that series was particularly interesting for me, because it showed me how we can learn about other faiths in a way that adds to our knowledge. So that book is about Bad Day at the Vulture Club. It's about the murder of a very wealthy Parsi gentleman in Bombay, or Mumbai as it's known. I didn't know anything about the Parsis when I went to India. The Parsis are not Hindus or Muslims. They are Zoroastrians who came from Persia, and they've been incredibly influential in India. And they don't bury or cremate their dead. What they do is they leave their dead out in these things. These are called towers of silence. They're concrete structures in the middle of Bombay, and they leave them for vultures to eat. So for me, that was incredibly fascinating to learn about another culture. And that, I think, is a message that we can all take away. When it comes to Islamophobia, there are the things that we think we know, but if we dig a bit deeper, we'll find that there are, facets that we don't know about this culture, which add to our knowledge and which will give us a different perspective. So I thought that would be a great background for a crime novel. Having lived in Mumbai for 10 years, I then decided that I wanted to look a little bit more at the history of India and what's happened in the 70 years since the subcontinent was partitioned and India became independent, as did Pakistan and later Bangladesh. And so I decided to look at a period of India just after Indian independence. And that took me to writing historical crime fiction, a new series. And so the time in India just after partition was quite turbulent. I mean, there were 300 million Indians, and now we have more than 1.3 billion. So there's been tremendous growth in the 70 years since. But it was also a time which was just in the shadow of partition, which not only had it chopped up the country, but it also caused intense racial tension, as we know from partition riots. And at the same time, Prime Minister Nehru, who took over after Gandhi was assassinated, he was trying to change the social fabric of society because he wanted to take away power and land from the feudal landowners, the Nawabs, and try to find a more equitable distribution of that around the country. So that was causing a lot of agitation. So for me, I thought this would be a really interesting period of Indian history within which to set the crime novel. Bombay is the location for that, 1950, and it was then, as now, known as India's City of Dreams, because people come from all over the subcontinent to find a life there. And it was known as the gateway to India, and obviously the home of Bollywood. The one fact that I found during my research, which gave me a hook for this particular book, the first in my new series, was that there were thousands of foreigners still in the city and tens of thousands of foreigners living in India after independence, because I had always thought that they all just left, the British and everybody else just left in 1947. But that wasn't the case at all. They persisted for quite a while afterwards. And so that led me to writing this book, the first in this new series, and it's called Midnight at Malabar House, and it introduces us to India's first female police inspector, Inspector Persis Wadia, who is a Parsi, like the people I just talked about. And she has newly qualified. Nobody wants to work with her. She's the only woman on the police force. She's sent to a police station called Malabar House, where all the misfits are sent. And then on New Year's Eve, 1949, a call arrives, and she is sent to the home of a very senior British diplomat who's been murdered at a New Year's Eve party. And so the sensational case lands on her lap. And then through the novel, we see her investigating this murder. But also I start to dig into that history of that era of India. Now, India at the time was a very paternalistic, sometimes misogynistic society. These are the kind of adverts that you could see in the newspapers promoting what they felt was the right occupation for a woman. Nevertheless, there were pioneers such as this. This is one of my favorites, a lady called Surya Thakral. Now, she married into a family of 8 pilots, and they were quite generous because when she said she expressed an interest in flying, they enrolled her in flight school. And after very, very few lessons, I think something like 8 hours, her flight instructor stood her next to a gypsy moth, the airplane behind her, and said, "Go ahead, take it up for a spin." And she managed to do that without killing herself. And eventually she went on to become India's first fully licensed female pilot, in spite of only having 8 hours worth of tuition. And this lady is the inspiration behind the character of Persis Wadia. She's India's actual first female police inspector. Now, she actually came along about a decade later than I've set my story, but that's because the period I wanted to investigate is just after partition, slightly earlier than Shanti was around. Now, having studied a lot of Indian history over the last couple of years while I've been writing this novel, it occurred to me that this man's wisdom, which is many of you will have read or seen, would be incredibly useful in today's climate where we are so quick to try and blame others, other communities, other sections of society for our problems or for society's problems as a whole. And he's, of course, Gandhi, and this is in his days as a lawyer. And the reason that I found a particularly strong connection to him is because we in Newham do have a very strong connection to Gandhi. Now, a few years ago, while I was out walking, I live in Newham. I should have said that I continue to live in Newham. I came across the Gandhi Chaplin Memorial Park, and that sent me Googling to try and figure out what that was all about. And that's what this was about. In 1931, Gandhi came to Canning Town in Newham, came to the home of a doctor acquaintance of his, and he actually came there at the request to meet Charlie Chaplin. That's the chap sitting on his right. Gandhi was in town for a conference about the Quit India movement, but Chaplin, who was a huge fan of Gandhi, had written to him in India, and Gandhi had picked up and read this letter, and he had no clue who Charlie Chaplin was. He asked one of his aides, and they told him it was just some American clown, like a circus clown. They didn't actually know what he did. But Chaplin was a huge fan. He persisted and he managed to get Gandhi to finally visit him, and he came out incredibly inspired and effusive in his praise about Gandhi. And here is Gandhi making friends with people from East London while he was here. So just to finish off, Muslims in Britain today, I mean, we come in all sorts of shapes, sizes, and ambitions. What I think we have now, going back to the title of my talk, is more latitude in the ambitions that we're allowed by our families and by the social structures within which we operate. So my parents, you know, they really didn't want me to be a writer because they could see no financial sense in it. And, you know, I don't blame them from that. They came from poverty. They wanted their kids to be educated, and they doctor, lawyer, accountant is the, you know, is the pinnacle as far as they were concerned. Today, of course, we know that there are many, many more occupations that are open to not just Muslims, but people of any description. Now, some of those have barriers, and the publishing industry, where I found a home and you know, I've been able to fulfill my lifelong ambition, is notorious for the barriers that are in place there. And for me, it's been a long, hard process of trying to get past those barriers. Some of those are systemic in that the vast majority, 90% plus of people in the industry, from agents to editors, are of a particular background, a white middle class background. So getting past that, it's not always a question of racism. It's often to do with something has succeeded before, so why should we change? Why should we, why should we fix something that's not broken? If you're having success with white writers, why should we represent somebody different when it might not work? We might lose money, and the industry is, of course, a business. So once you've got your head around that, you have to try and find a way through that. And it's not easy even now, but at least the good news is that the industry is going through this period of self-reflection and trying to become more diverse and looking for more diverse voices. And I'm glad to say that some of those voices are Muslim in background, but I'm equally glad that many of those voices are from Black backgrounds or from working class backgrounds or from, backgrounds that have not traditionally been represented in the industry. The one thing that I do know as a society is that none of these barriers can be broken down unless we have a united effort. And that means not just people from across the Muslim spectrum, but people from different faiths and people from different cultural backgrounds. And the very last thing I'll say is that if you do choose to read one of my books, yes, they're available in most bookshops and Amazon and online, etc., but it would be wonderful if you could support our local bookshop, the Newham bookshop, which, you may not know this, has a tremendous reputation within the publishing industry in the UK. And that's because it's been around in the same place for 40 years, and the proprietor, Vivian, has been there for about 35 or more years. And she'll order any book that you want. So it's really would be great if you decided to read one of these books, is to support the Newham bookshop. And I think I can end it there.
Thank you so much, Vaseem. That's wonderful. I take my hat off to you. I wrote one book a few years ago, and it was incredibly hard work, and I've never attempted to write another one. So brilliant that all the ones that you've written, and I look forward very much to reading them. You've really got our imaginations going. Thank you very much indeed. And some questions I've no doubt will be forthcoming from our members here today on the webinar in due course. So thank you very much. That's great. Thank you. Now, we're now going to go on to Rabiah Mali from the Pearls of Islam. Now, let's see what we're going to see. Here we are. I could tell you so much about Pearls of Islam. Love is my foundation, that very special strapline there, which would be, for so many of us, the only way forward. But they are first-generation Caribbean Muslims who were brought up on Jamaican folk music and Guyanese soca and soul music. So an influence of many different cultures can be found in their words and style. The music has been described by many as music from one heart to another heart, and their focus is universal spirituality and music as a means of healing, both for mind and soul. And I think at this time, this very strange time of the pandemic, it for many, many of us, music has been a huge force for good in our lives. So, can I hand over to you, Pearls of Islam, Rabiah Mali? Are you coming in? Are you there? What are you going to do for us?
I am.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful introduction. I just about recognized our own bio there. So thank you so much. And thank you so much for those that have kind of shared their creativity beforehand. I found both Shahed and Vaseem's presentations really inspiring, really interesting. And I learned so much about Newham as well. I myself am Rabiah Mali. I am actually a Newhamite. I don't know if I've just made up that term, but yes, I too, born and bred in Newham, a Newham general baby, as they say. And that's where my story begins. I am a singer, a musician, a creative. I'm also a herbalist, and that's kind of some of the titles that I've been boxed into. But there's so much more that I like to think that I'm able to do with my creativity as well. So just to let you know a little bit about myself, I'll give you a little bit of a background. Like I said, I'm born and bred in Newham, East London. As Anne beautifully said, my parents are coming from the Caribbean. My father's Jamaican and my mother is Guyanese. And they converted to Islam. And so we were raised in a way of trying to bring those two worlds together, trying to find a manifestation and a way that Islam can look that is very authentically Muslim, but then at the same time, very much in sync with our Caribbean roots. And that's something, believe it or not, at the time when we were growing up, which I know it might look it, but it was a few years ago, quite a few years ago. So it was that challenge of really embracing our Caribbean heritage and embracing a Muslim, what we thought was a Muslim, what Muslim culture was. And I think as we've grown through the years, I think we've realized that very much so. There's a lot within our Caribbean tradition that is very much in sync with Islam. And that part of that marrying of those two ideas and those two kind of cultures and those two worlds is where Pearls of Islam came from, which was us trying to bring that together. So for us, music and singing has always been part of our culture. And thankfully, it's something that's always been welcomed within my family home, within our home itself. There has been periods of time where, as my parents were, understanding different interpretations of Islam, there were times where, music maybe wasn't fully understood and maybe it was put to the side. But then I think the more they grew into the religion, the more they realized how beautiful and how important the idea of creativity, particularly the arts, particularly music, has when it comes to the practice of the religion. So for us, we were encouraged to sing. We always had drums in the house. We would sing Arabic songs, qasidas, they are called, which is the Arabic term for poetry, Arabic poetry that is normally dedicated to the Prophet Mohammed, peace be upon him, and to the praise of Allah. So we would sing these things together. We'd be in the home on Eid. We would be like, okay, let's sing some of these qasidas. But there was always this lacking of English poetry, English songs. Really, there was a big lacking. So my mother used to write her own little songs and, add English words to it. And then thankfully there was a beautiful movement, pretty much led by Cat Stevens, Yusuf Islam, where he kind of stepped back into music and he really brought the English kind of speaking nasheeds back into the forefront. And I think that's what really hugely inspired us to really start stepping into writing our own as well. So I put it down to both my mother and the encouragement of Cat Stevens, Yusuf Islam. So I think for us, when we started, it was very much just singing, maybe at the local community. Like we had a Caribbean community, not based in Newham, although I was born and bred in Newham, not based in Newham, we used to have to travel to South London for that Muslim Caribbean community. And we started to sing a lot at the Eid events, and we would drum, and it would just be very kind of like, you know, get the kids up in front and sing. But I think the more we started to do it, the more it was recognized as, okay, this is something that's quite different, it's something that's quite beautiful, and it's something that I think others wanted to share. And so, to cut a very, very long story short, we eventually kind of formed a group of myself and a few other sisters, all from the Caribbean background. And we started to form a group where we would drum and we would sing, and we started to travel around the UK to small kind of religious gatherings. We would go and we would sing some songs, and it's a blessing that we were received in a really beautiful way. And I think the more we started to do it, the more it started to grow, and the more we were invited to share. And as we grew, our art form grew. It moved away from being a place of, perhaps it moved away from a little bit from being a place of just, you know, drumming and singing, and it moved into it transformed into what we were creatively. And so we started to use a lot of drums, guitar, and other sorts of instruments as well. So that's, I'm just going to quickly share my screen with you. So we're able to kind of, as I'm talking, we can actually have something to look at as well. So that's where we were. That was our journey. And as we grew into it, what we also had was this really, yeah, as we also kind of stepped into it, the more we were invited to some really larger stages, Trafalgar Square, British Museum, to name a few, just all over the world. I find it really difficult to speak about our achievements, and that's something that I need to really polish on, but across the whole entire world. And I think part of that was because of what we were doing as being our authentic kind of Black, British, Caribbean, Muslim selves, and creating an art form that really reflected that. It was something that was so unique and something that was so different, that there were definitely spaces that realized that there was a need for something that a lot more people could relate to, something that was in English, something that sounded like something that they could relate to. And so we were invited, and that was such a blessing. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. And I think the more we started to perform, the more we started to kind of be in these different spaces. And don't get me wrong, I'm not going to dismiss the challenges that we had, particularly being one of the first on these stages. A lot of the times we were the first Muslim women on a lot of these stages, particularly of audiences where there were male and females, of mixed audiences. We were the first ones to kind of be on that stage as Muslim women singing. So naturally there was a lot of challenges, and there's going to be a lot of barriers, particularly when it comes to something that's different. And I think that seems to be the case. Whenever there's something different, you're always going to get some kind of resistance. But I have to say, I do look back on those many years, particularly at the early stages where there was a lot of resistance. I can only look back on it in a very fond way. And I look back on it and I realize, only in hindsight, I realize how incredibly brave we were to step on some of these stages. I really realized how brave we were to do it. And I'm really thankful now that as time has passed, there's a lot more opening for a lot more Muslim women to kind of step into a space and share their creativity, which is such a blessing. There's some more pictures of us. So last year was the moment that we actually recorded our album, and we had a huge, beautiful launch, and it was really well received as well. And one of the things that we also found, the more platforms that we went onto, the more we were approached by so many different women, particularly regarding our drumming. Because there was, I think, and I don't know if you'll hear any of it today, if there's any recordings of it, but particularly when you hear the drumming. I think if anyone hears drumming, like there's a beautiful saying that if you're human, when you hear the drum, your foot will tap. Like it's a rhythmic beat. It will make you, it will touch you, it will move you, whether that be physically or spiritually. Particularly with the art form that we do, all of our art form, all of our music, all of our songs are very devotional, right? All of them are devotional. All of them are in remembrance of Allah and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So particularly when we're using the drums, it's a really beautiful way of uplifting people and really connecting to people in that way. And so a lot of women would approach us and ask us about drumming and how they've always wanted to do drumming, and they're a little bit nervous about doing the drumming, and how could we step into it? Could we teach them? And this is where we stepped from being performers, so to put it, those that shared our creativity, into a space of creating a platform for those to nourish their own creativity, which I think is such an honor to be able to witness that. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things, I must say, with what we've done with Paths of Islam. And one of the things I'm really proud of when it comes to Paths of Islam is the amount of platforms that we've created for other Muslim women to start to nourish that creativity and create a space where they can feel safe to really explore that creativity without being judged according to how they're playing, whether it's sound, or even that judgment of whether their musicality is embraced within their spirituality. I will say that there are lots of different opinions when it comes to the use of musical instruments within Islam, and I want to recognize that. And I want to say before anything turns into like a discussion of whether something is allowed or not allowed, I will say that the many different opinions on it, and we try and embrace and accept, and we try to be respectful of all of them. We do also know that there's a huge history and a huge heritage of music within our Islamic tradition, within our Islamic culture and our heritage as well. For so many, historically, a lot of the Muslims have really mastered a lot of the arts and mastered a lot of the playing of instruments, and we can use the guitar as an example of that. Particularly when we look at the Muslim Spain, we can see that's where a lot of that kind of influence came in as well. So we honor that and we respect that, and we create spaces for those that want to kind of nourish that part of them inside, part of themselves. So we set up a drumming school, and it was called the Tumaida bint Amr Drumming School. Tumaida bint Amr is a companion of the Prophet Mohammed, peace be upon him, and she was a poet. And we really wanted to honor our female poet from the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And so we named our drumming school after her. And what we ended up doing was being a space of teaching women the djembe and the darabuka. But on top of that, also be as a means of sharing traditional qasaids, traditional Arabic songs, but also English songs as well. And really encouraging that aspect of, and this is something that is very much rooted in us, is you don't have to, creativity is a seed that we all have within us. And often, particularly now that creativity has turned more into a space of showcasing. So it's very much now of, particularly music is more of, it's an observation. We watch somebody play something, we watch somebody sing. And traditionally, that's never been the case. And I think that that's a tradition within all cultures and all religions, like to watch somebody sing and to watch somebody perform has not been part of sacred creativity. It's always been quite a collective thing. And so we're trying to get ourselves back into that space where we're encouraging the ladies that work with us that this is not a space of you need to sound like I don't know, you don't need to sound like a Beyonce or Whitney Houston's. As long as you're nourishing that creativity, we want you to share. And even if you don't want to share, you don't have to share, but as long as you're in a space of nourishing that as well.
There's 2 minutes now, Rabiah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Time has gone by so quickly, but thank you so much. So that kind of speaks to what we've been doing and how that's been happening. Also, on top of that, what's happening now is the idea of creating spaces for those to be shared, creating platforms where perhaps earlier on in our journey, we might have not been welcome because of whether it be because of our art form, or whether it be because we were women, whether it be because we were Black. We wanted to create spaces where women who had creativity were welcome. And this is where the movement of Ladies of Light kind of came into. And that's what we're doing now, is kind of nourishing those spaces. I will end with I'll go back to what I said at the beginning, which is this idea of creativity not being boxed. It's not confined to being a craft. It's not confined to being an art form. We really want to nourish this idea of creativity being, to find the creativity in everyday life, find the creativity in gardening, find the creativity in your cooking, because it's there. And that's very much what we're rooted with. I will end with a saying by Hazrat Inayat Khan, which is, life is a symphony, and the action of every person is the playing of their particular part in that music. So just being in existence is you being creative and you being part of this life, the music, the harmony of everything. But thank you so much. And if there are any questions, please do ask, because there's so much more that I would have loved to have spoken about. But thank you.
That's absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much, Rabiah. I found that fascinating and wonderfully creative, and I love the metaphor of life being a symphony. Yes, we've all got our parts to play, and curiously, when we all play together, it sounds even better than each of us playing separately, doesn't it? I think for me, definitely, there's a lot of music in heaven, and you've brought some of that to us this evening. So thank you. And just before we all leave in half an hour or so, we're going to hear some of your music, and I'm really looking forward to that. Thank you again, Rabiah. That's marvellous. Great. And on we go to our next contributor, Mohammed Ali, who's an MBE, and he's, I don't know, I hope he's going to explain this to us, because the Aerosol, Arabic and Soul City Arts founder, it sounds like something that my children would talk about, I think. So I hope, Mohammed, that you can unpack that for us. I love street art, and Mohammed, who's an artist, educator and curator, was born and raised in the UK, and he's been a pioneer in the street art movement, initially fusing street art with Islamic script and patterns, delivering powerful and moving messages that spoke to all. And his art has inspired and informed a new generation across the globe, boldly to express their identity and their ideals. So, Mohammed, it's over to you. Please tell me about the Aerosol, Arabic and Soul City Arts.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much. Right, so I will hopefully take you on a bit of a journey and explain what that title you mentioned is actually. Aerosol Arabic was the artist name that I used to go by when I was fusing a lot of Arabic scripts inspired by my faith as a Muslim with the Aerosol Canon, being a street artist and being one, you know, since the 80s, I guess, late 80s, and being involved with street art and bringing those two worlds together, and the collision, if you like, of these two worlds was kind of where I kind of got my name from. Although as you grow, I've evolved and I've started dabbling in other things and other mediums. So I don't really use that name so much. I also set up an organization called Soul City Arts, which is the kind of system that I tried to create so that it wasn't just, I always like to put it as my art, not just being a one-off set of fireworks that are wonderful and this explosion of color, but actually what happens when the dust settles? How can I kind of inform and contribute to something where we're thinking about generations and, you know, and the future generations? You know, I became more and more committed, especially having children myself and growing teenage children. I started to really think about my contribution and what I can leave as legacy as well. So before anything, I'm going to take this awful green background off in case you're wondering what is going on with that, right? So I'm going to jump across to this format, right? I'm hoping you can now see less of the green background and you're seeing me in a new environment, okay? The reason I do this is I've quite, as you can probably see from my setup in the various cameras, during the lockdown period, I've been doing a lot of live streaming as I'm used to traveling around the world quite a lot, painting murals and delivering festivals and things like that around the globe. You can imagine the COVID period has really changed everything. It's been a game changer. So I've adapted quite well, and I've set up my studio here in my home. And as I said, as we were heading towards Zoom gloom, I felt like wanting to offer something a little bit different. And offering a little bit something different is really, in essence, what me as an artist and the many artists that I, you know, the community that I come from, is what we like to do. We try to give something a little bit different, especially when we're expressing our faith, because in an age of, I always describe it as kind of information overload, where the visual landscape, we are kind of bombarded with visuals, whether it's on the streets and billboards or whether it's on our phones and our devices, just constantly scrolling through this endless, you know, landscape of visuals. How do we create something that acts almost as a kind of, I always like to describe it as a glitch type moment. The murals that I paint, I like to describe them as these kind of glitches, and a kind of an anomaly, something that stands out, that makes it kind of, makes something like jump out at you, leap out almost as you're driving. Well, hopefully not when you're driving or when you're stationary in your car, right? When you're stationary in your car in the traffic, or you're going to work, you're going to school, you see these images that speak to you, but we wanted to try and say something a little bit different, a little bit, you know, the spiritual message being at the heart of what I do. I want to build on Rabiah's fantastic point at the end, where she says creativity is in everyday life and we shouldn't box off creativity. In essence, as a graffiti artist or a street artist or whatever other posh title you want to give it, urban artist as well, there's many others. The essence of street art was exactly that. It was art literally spilling outside into the public spaces, into the kind of non-conventional spaces that are coming outside of the galleries. And that's, for me, really sums up what Rabiah's point about creativity being in everyday life. That's what street art is, public art. When we put it on a street corner, we were literally bringing a bit of color to the streets, a place where you wouldn't expect to see such art. And through the art that I create, and when I was getting more and more involved with street art, let me just jump through a few slides, hang on, jump across. These are just some interesting backgrounds that might make things a little bit more exciting for you. The murals I was painting, and this one is probably the one that's most familiar to some of you, as it's in Newham. It's in just off the Green Street, on the side of an Islamic bookstore called the Zamzam bookstore. I painted this, I think, well over a decade ago. And you'll see the message here in Arabic and in English, knowledge, ilm in Arabic, and the concept of a weapon against mass distraction alongside it. So when I was painting such murals, and these are just a few other examples of such murals, this one I painted last year just in the King's Cross area. Often there would be Islamic influence of the calligraphy or geometric patterns, as you heard me in the biography, it was mentioned that I explore with geometric design as well. But sometimes it might just be informed by kind of our stories, perhaps, as Muslims, as some of the Muslims, not all Muslims, as we know, not all Muslims were migrants. Some were, you know, people who were born here, or perhaps who were, you know, not of kind of immigrant background at all. But some of the stories, what I chose to put at the heart of my murals, were informed by the stories of, you know, migrants like my father, and when he came here in the 50s. So a lot of my murals, kind of, as you can see here, is an example of the geometric design and the patterns that we spoke about earlier. And Shahed mentioned about the kind of fusing or combination of Celtic patterns. I heard him mention, and my ears pricked up, because that's something I quite often like to do, as you can see in this example of Celtic knots on the right hand side, with the Islamic geometric design here on the left. And this was in an area where there was a strong Irish community before the Muslim kind of communities came, the migrants, and settled in this area. And that's kind of what that was, a bit of a nod to the kind of the community. So finishing on that point I mentioned about Rabiah's point, that creativity is in everyday life. As a street artist, I would say that making art, or taking it away from those kind of world of that kind of the esoteric, the very kind of the high art place, and bringing art in the everyday life, you know, just as street art does, is something I became, and I still am, very, very, very passionate about. We must take art and bring it into a kind of tangible form that the everyday people can connect with and resonate with. I think I always say that, you know, what I like to do is take the lives of ordinary people and tell their stories in extraordinary form. So in the form of these murals, as you see here, I'm going to just slide through these on my iPad over here. You can see this was a mural in Dubai I did a number of years ago. I'll just flick through some of these murals to give you a bit of a visual. street. This was a verse. I'll zoom in on this one. Verse from the Quran. By means of water, we give life to everything. And this was a verse from the Quran about life and the existence of life. Here, another example where I'll zoom in on this one here for you. Hope it's working, this zooming thing. So we've got here kind of geometric designs that I mentioned. And I'll scroll across, and the kind of the Irish Celtic knots. And there was an Irish pub that I was kind of, there was a little nod to the Irish pub on that street as well. You can see with the clock tower. A bit of a mosque and a pub juxtaposition there. You got to have a pub. You can see here in Edinburgh in Scotland, again, looking at local melding with the environment. It's something perhaps you don't often see in the streets of, say, Shoreditch or Brick Lane, where you see a lot of street art that pretty much is almost plonked into place. I always like to describe my approach a bit similar to Shahed's in a way, perhaps in the architecture world, which is to kind of look at your art being something that complements and melds with its environment, as opposed to just cut and paste vision of placing your art almost as if an alien ship has landed. So as you can see here, this is in Edinburgh in Scotland, the colors of the blue and white and the patterns of the Celtic patterns. This is a kind of a distant view of it here. These are the things I kind of quite often like to do, which is about making art complementary to the space and making it look as if it's kind of supposed to be there, if you like. So just flying through, forgive me if I'm going a little bit too fast, but I'm conscious of lack of time, so I'll just keep going through. Let me see what else have we got here for you. The one in, let's have a look. Here we go. This one's probably a good example. This example here you see on your screen is in Dublin, when I was invited by the authorities there, because there was some tensions that were existing amongst new immigrants from mostly Sudan and Muslim countries, and the local community here in the Fatima Mansions estate in Dublin. And what you'll see is just an example of the color palette that I chose to use here. And you'll see how the mural here on the bottom, how I kind of almost lifted the colors from the new build, the apartments that you see behind here, right? And, you know, again, it's just an example of how often I really like to look at how a piece of art feels like, and another example here of just turning your back to the wall. I always say that to any street artist, turn your back to the wall and almost just soak in the environment, engage with the everyday people, listen to their stories. Before you cut and paste your mural into a locality, into a neighborhood perhaps that has a rich history and heritage. For example, Brick Lane, right? When we look at the Jewish community, we look at the Bangladeshi community, how much of those stories do we actually see in the art itself, right? And
that's 2 minutes, Mohammed. Thank you.
You're almost done. There's fundamental questions that I like to ask as an artist, that's kind of incorporating people's stories and celebrating our faith, our narratives unashamedly, without being apologetic. Yeah, I've been quite blessed for about 20 years now, being painting and using my faith as a Muslim and embedding that, our stories and our experiences into the art. But I'd say my approach has changed radically over the years. Perhaps once upon a time I would have been on, you know, the BBC or CNN, as I have, talking about terrorism and extremism and saying my art is an attempt to challenge that. There came a point where I said, I'm not interested. I don't really want to be kind of, you know, using the mic to do that. We just need to celebrate who we are confidently and just be comfortable with who we are without having to read out speeches saying we are peaceful people. So I'd say over the years, you know, you grow, you learn, and you actually realize we need to use our efforts as alternative communicators to not preach to the converted. How do we engage with the people that really want to eat you alive? And those are the times that I get really excited, when I'm placed in an environment where I'm going to look at, you know, really transforming perceptions. So on that note, I will finish. I think I can end on that note. I hope that's been, I hope I haven't spoken for too long. Over to you guys.
No, that's absolutely fantastic, Mohammed. Thank you very much. Of course, now I can see the aerosol. Now I can see where that comes from. And that's brilliant. I love your work. That is fantastic. I think it's going to be better than a Banksy, because people can own a Banksy, whereas everybody shares your work. And that's what we love to do here in Newham. So thank you very much indeed. That was a brilliant presentation, and I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure everybody else does too. Thank you. Now we come on to our question and answers, and I can see there are 5 questions in the box. The easy ones, thanks. I missed the first section. Will the webinar be available to view again? Yes, it will. That's why we're recording it. I wonder if somebody could tell us where and how it's going to be available, please, so that John Hudson and others who've missed it can see it. Thank you. That's great. Then I need to ask the panelists, would you be interested in performing and exhibiting in Queen's Market, one of the truly multicultural spaces in Newham? Martin Pinder, you're asking that question. Who would like to answer that? I wonder, Mohammed, are you going to do a picture there?
Am I going to do
a picture in Green Street? Would you do one of your wall art?
We can certainly speak about it. I'm more open to the conversation, absolutely.
Brilliant, thank you. And Rabiah, would you be able to come and sing in Green Street and do some poetry one day?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm happy to have a conversation. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And Vaseem, you told us that your books are available at the Parents Centre, which of course is just a stone's throw from Green Street. So that's good. They're available there, aren't they, your books?
I also do a lot of work with Newham libraries. So, I'm quite used to doing a lot of work with the council in Newham to promote reading and writing, all sorts of things.
That's fantastic, thank you. And by no means least, Shahed, I'm not sure you can build a mosque in Queen's Market, but I'm sure you will be showing more of your wonderful designs, will you?
No, yeah, I'd love to. I mean, I'd love to actually make something maybe out of salvaged material and build something within the market that's really fun. I love that market. It's a great space.
Fantastic. Yes, it was where my grandmother took me very regularly when I was a child. Now stay there, Shahed, because there's a question. Can you see the question from Nora at the beginning? Would you like to answer that, please?
Yeah, I would. I can't turn my video on. I wonder if we should put our videos on, the panelists.
Please do, if you can.
I actually can't. It says...
No, we can't at the moment. Okay, now we can.
Now we can,
there you are.
Yeah, that might be nicer for people to see who they're speaking to, yeah.
Yeah. I noticed the horse. I noticed the horse and what looked like a sort of mermaid as well.
Oh, is there a mosque? I'm wondering why some mosques in the pictures have images of a horse. Oh, I don't remember that. I'd have to have a look.
On the tile. It was one of the tiles.
Ah, yeah, one of the tiles. That's right. That was from from Anatolia, I think, to sort of 13th century tiles. And I think in the history of Islamic architecture, there's been so many variations of things that in different periods of time, all sorts of things have been, and because it's such a diverse history as well, often Islamic art would incorporate the culture of a particular place that it was in, and that place may well have had the culture of animals or horses or flowers and things like that, and that becomes incorporated into sort of Islamic art. So it's very varied and very diverse once you start looking at what's been produced over history.
Thank you, that's great. On to Vaseem now. The difference between London or Newham and Mumbai. What are the main differences you found? In about 2 minutes, please.
2 of the biggest cities in the world.
Yeah. Tell us all the differences.
I suppose that well, I was in India from 97 to 2006, and it was a different environment to the India today, and again, Newham was a completely different environment to back then as well. When I grew up, some people may recognize this, but Saturdays were a no-go zone on Green Street because West Ham were playing, and there was a lot of hooliganism, a lot of racism within that environment when we were growing up. That thankfully has changed greatly now, largely because of the changing dynamic of the population in Newham, but also because of better perspectives on different communities, and we've all learned to live together a lot better. And Bombay was very much like that when I first went there, very cosmopolitan. Everybody just got on with things. Yes, religious strife does occasionally raise its head across India now and again, but thankfully it's very rare and very isolated. And usually it's at the instigation of a few members of society, politicians, etc., rattling their sabers for their own ends. So overall, I think the two cities have a lot in common, but you know, they're very, very interesting places to live from different points of view.
Thank you, but Newham's better. Of course it is, because we're here.
I was born here, so
we're here. Yes, exactly. That's right. Thank you very much. And here's one for Rabiah. Muslim women nowadays overlooked because of their hijab. People don't see their knowledge. How can we work on that together, Rabiah? You and me both.
Yeah, I think that's a question for like a whole different panel. We could go into that. I feel like I think it's important to recognize that things are moving forward and things are getting better compared to how it might have been a few years ago. And I think we should celebrate that as well. I think it's also very important to, as a Muslim woman who wears the hijab, for me to kind of stand in my ground as knowing that people that overlook me, it's their loss. And it really is their loss. It's their loss to their craft. It's their loss to their community. It's their loss to whatever their platform. It's their loss. And as a platform of creators, and as a platform as a borough, as a community of Newham Borough, I think it's important that we create spaces where women can feel embraced, regardless of what they look like, whether that be hijabbed or non-hijabbed, black, white, any ethnicity.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Rabiah. Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. We just want all the space, really, don't we? We want to be able to go wherever we want to go, just the same as anybody else does. That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Rabiah. Let's look at this one here. Hold on. Now, Mohammed, do you believe that artwork can bridge communities and change perspectives of how people view a situation? And how do you think your art's been able to do that so far?
Sure, I think absolutely. I think you know the answer. I absolutely think things can change. However, I'd say at the start, like I said at the start, about doing something that might be our kind of one-off golden moment, as opposed to a strategic change over a period of time. I would say that the interventions that we create really need to be something that's developed in a much more kind of a coherent kind of strategic plan, which is why I mentioned about working strategically. Just a piece of art on a wall might change something, but how does that lead to that kind of that broader change and perception change? So I'd say absolutely, I've seen it, with my own eyes, of people who say, I don't want to repeat the words, but I've been in areas that were known to be racist, and people who have said, you know what, when you first came here and you were painting that wall, we thought you were, and I'm not going to mention the words that they mentioned, very, very negative. And some of these guys, we become good friends now, where they're calling me up and saying, no word of a lie. One of them phones me up and says, do you, I've just seen Newsnight. Do you guys believe in, and I just thought it was wonderful that he had an outlet to call me up and say, I'm watching this junk on TV, but I want to know what you really think. Those are the things that, look at that, you would never imagine a piece of art can lead to that kind of change.
No, that's fantastic. But in a sense, it's that inspirational otherness, isn't it? That somehow takes us out of the practical touchable world, and shows us something new and different in I would say a heavenly sort of way. So are you planning other projects? A food-based project? What did you do with the food? Didn't throw that at the wall, did you?
I had 15 minutes, right? Believe me, I've only just finished the service. This is Kate, who runs the Bloomsbury Festival.
That's right.
And she invited me for one of the murals. And what she's referring to, as I mentioned, for me, just painting the wall, I think it needs a kind of a strategic attack from different directions. So the food, music, right, visual arts. I always say, and I come from a gaming background, I used to work for a games company. I always say, just like I was in games, right? When I was designing games in the days of Sony PlayStation 1, just for those who might remember, when I was designing the games, I was creating things that you could see, the visuals, the music, the sounds, the joypad would shake in your hand. When you hit people from different directions with multidisciplines, you literally have people eating out of the palm of your hands. So the dining thing that Kate's mentioning is just another strand when we immerse the viewer, right, in all of these senses, if you like, with all these multi-sensory experiences of taste, touch, smell, visuals, and sound. Literally, you watch the change that occurs in those moments. So yeah, I'm still working on food projects, is what Kate's saying. But you can see that on my website or Google it, and you'll probably learn a bit more about that.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. I'd love to. That's another one for Queen's Market, I think, because there's lots of food there. Thank you for the inspiration and the insightful webinar. Wonderful, the projects that we've watched. Has anyone researched the Muslim history of Newham? Now, Shahed, I know you've done some.
Yeah, I mean, I've done a little bit of work looking at the mosques in Newham, so a kind of survey and sort of overview of mosque buildings, looking at that from the point of view of their architecture, and sort of the idea is that through that to try and talk to some of the mosques and find out about their own histories and the histories of their communities, but not that I know of I don't know if the Muslim history of Newham has been looked at in a more sort of thorough way. I think it probably should.
I think probably it's been done from various. I think Colin Marchant has done some work around the arrival of Muslims and something about the history there. But I'd be glad to know, please, if anybody does know the answer to that question. We've talked about Green Street. Just one last thing about climate emergency. Right, you've got one sentence each to tell us. How can creative people contribute to reimagining our future, particularly from the Islamic perspective? In a sentence, Shahed, you're first.
I think just keep. You have to stay optimistic. I think that's just to keep making things and stay optimistic and think that things are gonna improve.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Vaseem. What do you think?
I'm going to be slightly cynical and say that you're going to have to convince a very large percentage of the world's population in developing countries that they shouldn't be allowed to get their industries up to the same level as the West before massive climate sanctions are imposed on them. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just telling you that having lived in India, there is very, very little appetite for climate change because they still kind of build their industries up to a certain level. So it's about trying to change their perceptions, but that is a really hard sell in those countries.
Thank you. For somebody who's been brought up to think that clean film is the answer to everything, it's quite hard to recognise that it's not good culturally. Not culturally, it's not good to the climate. That's the problem. Rabiah, how about you?
I love the question. It reflects some of the work that I'm actually doing with a place that we founded called the Green Dean Tribe. And a big part of that is actually to get the community back into nature and to get them into a space where they can engage with nature and start to create a relationship so that the activism comes from a sustainable way. So you're more encouraged to want to kind of live in a more sustainable way because you're building relationships with nature. So that's one way I would do it, particularly with the creative group.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And last but not least, Mohammed, What are you going to do about what have you got to say about climate?
I can't remember the question, but I'll just make a comment. I'll make a comment. It reminded me of a mural I painted in Melbourne a while ago, and the mural read, it was a statement from the Quran, which was guardians of this earth, Khalifatul Ard, and it just felt like a reminder for people that of what the Quran says about such things in a very simple, is what I said about just looking for ways to alternatively communicate, simple and tangible, and something that's quite grounded and not be this abstract idea. Just very simple. We are guardians of this earth, and Allah says this in the Quran, and it's just a bit of a reminder that right under our noses we have such reminders and messages.
That's great. Thank you so much. And thank you to all our panelists. What an inspirational, fantastic event we've had this evening. I feel truly blessed to have experienced it. And it certainly made me feel that I want to explore each of your work a bit further. So thank you to Shahed Saleem.
Thank you.
Thank you
Anna.
to Vaseem Khan. Thank you to Rabiah Mali. We're going to have some of your music in a moment. And thank you to Mohammed Ali. Thank you so much for all being here. We're still in Islamic Awareness Month. Look on the website and you can find out what else is happening on that front. And let's play ourselves out with some music from Pearls of Islam. Thank you. Thank you all for attending. I'm hoping some music might come.
Ya Rasulallah, Ya Habib Allah, Ya Shafi Allah, Ya Mustafa, Ya Rasulallah, Ya Nabi Ya Rahman, Ya Habib Allah, Ya Mustafa. مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق
And every time my heart beats, every teardrop that runs down these tear-stricken cheeks, I want it all to be for the sake of you, Nabi. I want my tears to be flowing while my heart is brightly glowing. I pray that these claims of love will one day be true, 'cause just as you love me, I want to love you too, Ya Rasulullah. يا نبي يا رحمة يا رسول الله
مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم العرب والعجم محمد خير من يمشي على قدم محمد باسط المعروف جامع محمد صاحب الإحسان والكرم مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق
Sometimes I can't hold back the tears from my eyes when I think about the blessed life of the blessed man. Me send him and him did not strive to take them out of the darkness and into the light.
For real,
The prophet was the perfect blend, the seal of the prophet, so the circuit end. I bear witness that Allah did provide the best and the blessed of all of the
مولاي
gods.
صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق I dream of Jannah and my Jannah's loving you. I dream of Jannah and my Jannah's loving you, Ya Rasulullah. Please let me love you. I dream of Jannah and my Jannah's loving you. I dream of Jannah and my Jannah's loving you, Ya Rasulullah. Please let me love you. La ilaha illallah. 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 La ilaha Muhammad Rasulullah.
Right. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Good night, everybody. God bless you.
No, thanks a lot.